One of the incomparable perks of living in Rome for me was that I could visit the Vatican museums at any time, especially during the winter months when there are fewer tourists around. I especially appreciated this privilege on reaching Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, which more than many other works of art requires time and sustained attention to disentangle its gigantic circular motion through the dense bundles of bodies. The restlessness, anguish, and excitement of this scene is in marked contrast to the harmony and peace emanating from God's creation of Adam on the ceiling, which the same Michelangelo had painted 25 years earlier. A cataclysm had happened in the intervening period with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. The upheaval generated by Luther's movement is comparable to what we are experiencing with the pandemic today. The perception of history of an entire generation is changed forever. Until a year ago, we could still entertain the illusion that despite occasional blips, the world order was relatively stable, and our lives with it. The huge jolt of the pandemic has punctured this illusion. Everything can spiral out of control in no time, at any time. Even though with the vaccines we start seeing the end of the tunnel, we will be ushered into a different kind of normality in which we will never shake off a lingering sense of threat hanging over our heads. Another virus, the climate emergency, another world conflict, who knows? Yet, we will persuade ourselves that we have taken back the reins of our destiny and try again to live as if nothing had happened. In our denial, we are just as complacent as the churchmen who, at their peril, commissioned Michelangelo's painting, and what is more, assigned him the unforgiving topic of the Last Judgment. In Scripture, judging and reigning are synonyms. By claiming that the Last Judgment belongs to Christ, the New Testament affirms that in the history of the world and in the story of each one of us, the final word belongs to God alone. And historical upheavals remind us of this reality, whether we like it or not. The Michelangelo who painted the Last Judgment had left behind the dream of perfection of his earlier years. He was looking for ways of alerting his contemporaries about their complacency, just as Matthew does in his stark parable of the Last Judgment. Most art critics argue that in this fresco, Christ's arms are a visual transposition of the reprobation expressed in Matthew's Gospel. Depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. This presupposes that the center of the anti-clockwise movement of the fresco is Christ's power to judge humanity by raising the dead at the bottom on the right, congregating them at his side, and removing those who deserved condemnation by plunging them towards the bottom of the fresco on his left side into hell. I believe, however, that there is a deeper and more specific focal point in the fresco that adds a farcical subtext to this plot. Besides judgment, the theatrical position of Christ's arms is performing another function. The right arm is raised to expose the rib cage to view, and the left arm ends with Christ's index pointing at the wound caused by the spear of the Roman soldier who pierced Jesus' body to make sure that he was definitely dead. This is the wound that persuaded Christ's adversaries and anyone whose life had been inconvenienced by this troublesome preacher that everything was back to normal. And if he really was God, as he claimed, well, then God was dead. In other case, all people wanted was to make sure they could go back to business as usual. Whenever I go to the actual location of this fresco, the Sistine Chapel, I cannot avoid being intensely aware that this is a hall where so much of the course of world history is shaped. This is the place where cardinals congregate to choose the new pope. This election has become less overtly political in the past century, but it cannot be denied that for most of its secular history, it was marked by scheming, corruption, simony, threats, and sometimes physical brutality. The act meant to epitomize the Church's commitment to let God's kingdom come through the appointment of Christ's highest representative on earth was conducted as if God was irrelevant, as if he was not acting in history, as if he was dead, and therefore as if there would never be any accountability for our human actions, especially by those who were supposed to be ministers of God. And if this was and still is the case of priests, bishops, and popes, how much more it applies to most of us who are even more enmeshed in the secular running of the world, not only those who preside over the destiny of the nations, but each one of us, even in our relatively inconspicuous lives. We all are included in the character of the fool of the book of Psalms who says, "There is no God," or might say that there is a God, but act as if there was none. So, in this same Sistine Chapel in which people kept acting blatantly as if there was no God, an older, mischievous and disenchanted Michelangelo depicts the whole movement of history as revolving on a center which is not Christ's triumphant power, but his mortal wound, God's death, that is, the tragic possibility of ignoring God in our lives. The provocative nature of this fresco is hard to miss and has generated endless controversies from the moment it was unveiled, to the point that during the following centuries, successive popes were tempted to erase it. And of course, despite the hysteria of Puritans of all times, the goading does not lie in the nakedness so profusely on display. That nakedness is a diversion. What decency can seriously be threatened by these oversized torsos with tiny heads, disjointed breasts, bulging love handles, tiny male organs, mostly covered after Michelangelo's death, especially when compared to the perfect proportions of Adam's body on the ceiling right above everyone's head? The main problem with people whose entire lives are enslaved to power and money grab is that they lose their sense of humor. Otherwise, how could they have missed the comicality of the fresco in, just to give few examples, the faces of the angels blowing the trumpets, St. Bartholomew holding his skin, which represents Michelangelo's features, the well-known pathetic, cowering, damned man, Charon viciously hitting the damned, not to mention the staged bearing of the beardless Christ. We think that we can take the Last Judgment seriously only if we depict and describe it in grave and stern tones. Sometimes, however, especially when dealing with violent paradoxes, a much more apt stylistic device is farce, with its ability to express the grotesque absurdity of a situation. And indeed, what grander farce than this symbolic hall which every so many years becomes the world's center stage, and in which not just cardinals, but all of us are placed under the huge Damocles sword of the supreme accountability depicted on its wall, and yet smugly maneuver as if it was a fiction, as if there was no God, as if the wound had indeed killed God and we were the masters of the world. We underestimate God's humor. This is why we end up completely missing the real focal point of the fresco, that is, the real throbbing heart of history, the locus where God's power really lies. We represent him to ourselves as this scowling divinity, when in reality he governs history from a wound, an empty cavity, that is, from a need, from his hunger and his thirst under the most improbable disguise. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.
Father Luigi, thank you so much, and welcome to the Festival of Preaching. I hope you can see the comments appearing in the chat bar. Great appreciation. You've really shown us how subversive humour can be, and how powerful it can be, handled well. And Alistair picks up that wonderful quote, which I wrote on my book: we underestimate God's humour. Could you maybe say a little more about how we do that, and how we might not underestimate it?
I suppose that, for me, one of the ways in which I have learned to unpack somehow God's humor is paying attention, true attention, to the wonderful dialogues we find in Scripture between God and people like Moses, like Nicodemus. For instance, I mean, just to give two examples, even Peter. There is something about, or even I'm thinking about Philip as well. So there is something about God liking to play with us and looking for people who are willing to let themselves be surprised by him. Very often our problem is that we are too serious. We have too many agendas. We come with too many kind of preconceived ideas and plans in reading Scripture or in our prayer, and we don't have the space to allow God to surprise us. And God's only way of doing it is by constantly shifting our focus. So it is very striking, as one knows. I'm not saying anything really special. I think that very rarely Jesus answered a question in the Gospels with a straightforward answer. Often he answers to a question with another question, or with a kind of bewildering image, precisely to do this. Shift the focus of our attention, help us to be more open-minded, bring us together beyond what we are willing to not only to do and to see, but also what we are willing to think God capable of. So yes, I mean, my idea or my sense is that reading the Scripture expecting God having a sense of humor can refresh the way we approach it.
There are more comments on this theme. Sue Nightingale says, don't forget Christ's humour. I think you're alluding to that. We forget how playful the parables were. We try to earnestly study them and comprehend them, and maybe we don't allow them to be open-ended. Two similar comments, Father Sheldon and Samantha. We're too serious, and we need to make space for God's humour. How might we do that, do you think? Can you help us out here?
Well, I mean, one of the ways I said is really pay attention to Scripture. The other thing I think is what I try to do in this sermon is something I've become more and more sensitive to over time, is engaging with art. Artists often are particularly perceptive when it comes to this. And Michelangelo, for me, is such a wonderful example. It is true that his art seems to many of us not spiritual enough sometimes, especially these kind of Renaissance paintings. The reality is that Michelangelo, for instance, was an incredibly committed Christian. He was part of the Oratory of Divine Love in 1517 with Reginald Pole, Vittoria Colonna, and other kind of humanists who were very receptive. The Catholic group in Rome, which was very receptive to the ideas of the Reformations, precisely because they brought some refreshing, really some renewal in faith, in Christianity, and in Catholicism. So he was someone who was a deep believer, and yet he was fiercely committed to the independence of the artistic endeavor. And he, as I think, I hope it appears from this, from the small commentary I made to this fresco, he was very capable of not only kind of giving a message, by giving it in such a way that it would echo God's way of hiding himself while revealing himself. This is something that Karl Barth has shown magnificently. God plays hide and seek with us constantly. He hides from our pride. He hides from those who know him. And he reveals himself to the people who come to him with empty hands, but also with, I like to say, with empty heads. By which I mean, we have to be capable to bracket sometimes our kind of convictions, also our commitments, not to become relativists, because this is not the point, but we need to be very careful about the risk of our own zeal, our own spirituality, our own commitment becoming a screen between us and God. And so, I mean, I could, many things could be said, but one of the ways in which I find myself renewed in the way I read Scripture, and I appreciate or try to appreciate what God does in history in my life, is through the help of art, because artists very often perceive this particular aspect more insightfully than theologians, for sure. Theologians probably are the last ones often capable of doing this.
I feel another event coming on, art and Christianity, and I think you'll be our main speaker there, Father Luigi. Your presentation, by the way, was absolutely fabulous. I think you must have been a television producer, as well as
I like to play.
Oh, so, a couple more questions. We're going into Lent and Holy Week. Not the kind of time of year where we think about humour, and so there is a question about dark humour that's unafraid of the negative. Do you think there's any room for a kind of qualified humour in the season that we're entering, given the world we're living in at the moment? That question is from Alison Tyler.
Yes, I mean, the humour of Lent this year is that probably we really need to take it lightly. I mean, we really, I would say, don't need resolutions this year, because we have been we have to acknowledge that life has been hard, difficult, and taxing enough. And I would suggest something that the Rule of St. Benedict says in the chapter of on Lent, which is that the essential thing is to go at the root of our desire. And wait, Easter, it says, with the eagerness of spiritual desire. I'm worried about resolutions often because when they are not just kind of resolutions we take just to lose some weight or to, the usual things, or because we love the idea of introducing some discipline in our life. So we say, oh, Lent is the right time. So, well, these already are not Lent resolutions. They are life resolutions, which can be taken at any other time. And I don't think they particularly help to live Lent properly. But the problem with resolutions is that, again, they can superimpose something which is too cerebral or too kind of wishful to our lives, when I think that it is very important to take advantage of this period, particularly this year, to try to understand prayerfully what is that we really desire, what is that really kind of we wish for ourselves, for our lives, for the world, and not just in a kind of superficial way. We all want the end of the pandemics and everything, but more deeply in terms of what gives us really joy, what gives us delight. It strikes me that the Augustinian spirituality, the Ignatian spirituality, the Benedictine spirituality all put joy, delight, and desire at our heart. And one of the greatest problems, I think, of our society today is that we don't take any more joy, delight, and desire seriously. Especially, we take pleasure very seriously, but pleasure can hijack our attention and prevent us from finding what really gives joy. And sometimes joy and pleasure are not exactly the same thing. So, I mean, if someone wants to take it as a joke or as a humor, well, I'm okay with it. But why we don't decide this year for Lent to try and find what gives us joy at a very deep level? Because this might kind of help us to welcome something that Jesus wants to give to us when he said that, I want to give you my joy.
So that's, as in my church, we've taken a lead from the reading for Proverbs last Sunday, wisdom delighting in creation. And so as a Lenten discipline, we're going to find what's bringing us delight and to remind ourselves that God delights in the human race. There's so much to make us kind of put that out of mind. That passage looks back to creation, and Kate has a question. Have you any comments about God's humour in creation? That's from Kate Ellis.
Well, I mean, God's humour in creation. I think that the creation of Eve for Adam, the creation of companionship, is something that says something about God's humor, insofar as it is a challenge, a constant challenge thrown at us to go beyond ourselves, to understand that we have access to our real identity only insofar as we let ourselves to be challenged, provoked, enriched by the other or the others. Now, this comes with a number of, I have tons of jokes that come to my mind about the relation between, in the first couple, as in all the couples that came afterwards, because it is obviously, sometimes people can wonder the extent to which, this is a gift, and the extent to which it is a penance. But it is the combination of both, which at its root is the fact that we need others. We need a significant other, a partner. We need significant others to be constantly kind of taken out of ourselves, because we have this tendency, unfortunately, to refer the whole world to ourselves. So being exposed constantly to the intractable reality of the other as other is something that we can deal with through exasperation and frustration, or can be properly, I think, dealt with the ability to let ourselves to be enriched and surprised, and with a lot of sense of humor. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, there's a lot of response to the idea of a day with Christianity and art, looking at paintings. And I should have remembered the Church Times is planning an event looking at some of the art in the Christchurch Picture Gallery, which is one of the most outstanding private collections in the country. A comment from Caroline Reed: God definitely has a sense of humour in allowing me to become an ordinand. Wonderful and engaging talk. Would love to hear more on humour, joy and faith. Do you deal with these topics in any of your books, Father Luigi?
Well, my book on Touched by God, A Way to Contemplative Prayer. So the central section is all about, it's a commentary of John's Gospel, in which I've taken the big dialogues, the dialogue with Samaritan woman, with Nicodemus, with Thomas, with Peter, and try to unpack exactly what I tried to explain at the beginning, the way in which God plays with us and helps us slowly to open our mind and our hearts to the novelty of what he wants to bring to our lives. So that in particular, I think, is one of the places in which I've dealt it from a scriptural viewpoint. And then, there is the book on monasticism, insofar as I think, especially the introductory chapter on folly and wisdom, there is something there about God's humor in really alerting us to the extent to which when we pretend that we offer his wisdom to the world, in reality we are only being the agents of folly. And there is something there which I know has been very very helpful meditating for me. So that could be, the initial chapter of the book of Benedictus is quite helpful for this.
Thank you. Well, that's something for us all to remember when we next preach. Remember, we are agents of folly. I think that's a wonderful description of preaching. And the book that Father Luigi just mentioned is on sale, Touched by God, your book on contemplative prayer. Father Luigi, thank you so much. It's been an utter joy to have your company. And thank you again very, very much.
It was a great pleasure for me too, and wonderful to be with you today.
Good. And I hope you've enjoyed all the comments that you've been able to see. Thank you so much.